What's going on, guys? It's Cimoooooooo. Now, if you want to play a deck that has one of the most consistent fusion engines in this game's history, a deck that can fusion summon monsters by banishing your opponent's resources, and these monsters have built-in Book of Moon and Ultimate Providence-like quick effects, well, let me introduce you to Invoked. Invoked are a fusion-based archetype that revolves around one key monster, Alistair the Invoker. The strength of the Invoked archetype lies in its flexibility to act as a supplemental engine for a myriad of different decks, effectively raising their ceiling and providing these decks with a plethora of new options. Most Invoked fusion monsters require Alistair the Invoker, as well as one other monster of a different attribute, depending on the monster you're attempting to fusion summon. Since the fusion requirements are relatively easy to achieve, combined with the ease at which the archetype can access its fusion spell, this allows you to put extra power on the board by accessing monsters that have built-in Book of Moon and Ultimate Providence-like effects. Since he's the focal point of the archetype, let's start by going over Alistair the Invoker. Alistair has some very relevant characteristics. Being a level 4, it is arguably the strongest level since it can meld naturally with so many other powerful level 4 archetypes like ABC or Zodiac. And being of Dark attribute, it has access to synergy with many of the powerful Dark support cards in the game like Allure of Darkness and BLS Envoy of the Beginning. His stat line isn't the best, boasting only a meager 1000 attack, but 1800 defense in a meta comprised of relatively small monsters can sometimes come in handy. When Alistair's normal summoned or flipped face up, you can add one Invocation, the deck's fusion spell, from deck to hand. You're going to be using this effect a lot, as the archetype is designed to abuse Alistair's searching capabilities. Keep in mind that this is not once per turn. Alistair also comes with another effect where during either player's turn, you can discard Alistair from hand to grave to boost a fusion monster's attack and defense by 1000 until the end of the turn. While it seldom comes up, it's important to note that like Alistair's search effect, this too is also not limited to once per turn, and also not restricted solely to invoked fusion monsters, just granting the archetype even more flexibility. We mentioned earlier that Invocation is the archetype's fusion spell, and it's a damn good one. Invocation limits your fusion capabilities by only allowing you to use fusion materials from your hand. However, these capabilities are greatly expanded when fusing for an invoked fusion monster, as you're allowed to banish monsters from your field and/or from either player's graveyard. Not only does this mean you can sometimes activate Invocation without needing to commit any of your resources already in your control, but it also allows you to disrupt your opponent's graveyard by using their monsters to fusion summon your own. And when we're in a meta where banishing our opponent's monsters from the graveyard can be detrimental to their strategy, it just makes Invocation all the more powerful. Oh, and just like Alistair, Invocation also isn't limited to being used once per turn. Now, if that weren't enough, while Invocation rests in the graveyard, you can target a copy of Alistair in the Banish Zone, shuffle Invocation back into the deck, and if you do, add Alistair back to your hand. As long as the resources are available, Invocation effectively creates a recursive loop where you can summon Alistair, add Invocation to hand, fusion summon and banish Alistair since it's on the field, then shuffle back Invocation into the deck and add Alistair back to hand. This also means you can get away with playing less copies of Invocation in the main deck, since Invocation is so both incredibly easy to access and recurs itself back into the deck. If Invocation wasn't already easy enough to access, Magical Meltdown is the archetype's field spell that tremendously bolsters consistency. Upon activation, you can add Alistair from deck to hand. A playset of Magical Meltdown plus a playset of Terraforming means you now have 9 ways to access Alistair the Invoker, and Invocation thereafter. Beyond that, Magical Meltdown also grants immunity from negation for any of your effects that fusion summon a fusion monster. For example, if you were to activate Invocation while Magical Meltdown is active, your opponent cannot activate a card like Solemn Warning in response. Bear in mind that Dimensional Barrier can still be activated because it isn't negating the activation of Invocation, but simply preventing the special summon of fusion-type monsters. Magical Meltdown also bestows you with a priority-like ability where your opponent cannot activate cards or effects when a monster is fusion summoned this way. If you understand how Stellar Knight Deltaros functions, it's the same principle, but simply put, this means your opponent cannot activate cards like Torrential Tribute and Bottomless Trap Hole in response to your monsters being fusion summoned, and then you gain priority to activate your effects. Rounding out the rest of the main deck support, the Book of the Law is an interesting quick play spell that allows you to tribute one invoked monster and special summon a different invoked monster from the extra deck with a different original attribute. And Omega Summon allows you to swarm the board with banished invoked monsters. Neither of these cards are commonly used within the archetype, especially when Invoked is being treated as a supplementary support engine, but they are a couple of decent cards that could be teched in depending on your preference. Now let's get into the Invoked fusion monsters. Invoked Caliga, the Dark Invoked fusion, is an interesting control-based monster that limits both players' abilities to activate effects, as well as limiting each player to only one attack per battle phase. Its stats are rather lackluster, and its effect is rather niche, so you shouldn't expect to see Caliga summoned too often. Next up is Invoked Raijin, the Wind Invoked fusion, and unlike Caliga, you should expect to see Raijin a lot. Raijin is a level 5 with 2200 attack and 2400 defense, with a built-in Book of Moon quick effect that can be used during either player's turn. This gives Raijin a lot of flexibility, especially in a format where Book of Moon is actually seeing a lot of play, since it can disrupt key combos. His stats are good, and being level 5 means he can also be summoned off of Instant Fusion, and he can flip himself face down and survives being destroyed by Instant Fusion during the end phase. Also, requiring a wind attribute fusion material is very relevant due to the Speedroid engine's popularity, as well as the Wind Witch engine currently seeing play as well, providing plenty of fodder for summoning Raijin. Invoked Cocytus, the Water Invoked fusion, has some nice built-in protection from your opponent's targeting and destruction effects. It also boasts a hefty 2900 defense, which is incredibly difficult for a lot of meta decks to run over in battle. And interestingly enough, Cocytus can attack while in face-up defense position, even though it applies its 1800 attack value when doing so. Cocytus doesn't really synergize well with Water or Paleozoic, which are currently the strongest competitive water-based decks in the game, but it's a decent addition to the archetype and might have a place in a future format. Then there's Invoked Purgatrio, the Fire Invoked fusion. Purgatrio has a lot of good things going for it. It has a base attack of 2300 and gains 200 attack for each card your opponent controls. Purgatrio can also attack all of your opponent's monsters once each, and if it attacks a defense position monster, it inflicts piercing. Aside from the fact that this card could OTK through a field of scapegoats in GOAT format, Purgatrio can actually be quite useful. Since Infernoids are a fire-based archetype, we can banish our opponent's Infernoids with Invocation to not only summon Purgatrio, but also remove another one of their resources from the game. Interestingly enough, Purgatrio can quite effectively counter a Void Feast if you already have Magical Meltdown active on the field. Since Magical Meltdown is active, your opponent cannot use their Decatron that has copied Onuku's effect to negate the activation of Invocation. Once summoned, Purgatrio will have a minimum of 2900 attack, since your opponent will control 2 Infernoid Decatrons and an Infernoid Siete. You could then attack through their entire board for a potential of 5700 damage. With that sort of lethality, let's be thankful that Purgatrio requires a fire fusion material rather than a water. Next up is Invoked Magellanica, the Earth Invoked fusion. Magellanica has a massive 3000 attack and 3300 defense. While it doesn't have any effects, having a massive beat stick can be really nice. Also, since it requires only an Earth monster, there are some combos with the Zodiac archetype that make Magellanica essential, because Zodiac really needed more synergy, right? Then there's Invoked Makaba, the Light Invoked fusion, and arguably the best. It has 2500 attack, which is nice, and Makaba also has a built-in Ultimate Providence-like effect, where if your opponent activates a card effect, if you send a card of the same type being monster, spell, or trap to the graveyard, Makaba will negate the activation and banish that card. What's neat is that because of the way the archetype recycles Alistair the Invoker back to your hand, you'll almost always have a guaranteed negation for monster effects. In addition, you could use dead copies of Terraforming or Magical Meltdown to negate spell effects as well. Light is also a very prominent attribute, with cards like Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit being widely played, and Photon Thrasher not only gives the deck light fodder, but it also gives the deck a free level 4 that you can overlay with Alistair for rank 4 plays. Finally, to wrap up the Invoked archetype, we have Invoked Elysium, the archetype's boss monster. Invoked Elysium has some different summoning requirements, requiring one invoked monster and one monster that was special summoned from the extra deck, but that's not too unrealistic to achieve. Elysium also has 3200 attack and 4000 defense, and while face up on the field, Invoked Elysium is considered to be all attributes. Not that it's too relevant, but if you want to tech Furin Kazan, be my guest. As a quick effect, Elysium can target an invoked monster that's either in your control or in your graveyard, banish it, and banish all monsters your opponent controls with the same attribute. That effect is pretty insane considering it doesn't target any of your opponent's monsters, and if you're really in a tight spot, Elysium can target itself, and since it's considered to be all attributes, it will banish all face-up monsters your opponent controls. Unless your opponent next levels you by summoning Obelisk the Tormentor first. I really hope you guys enjoyed this introduction to Invoked. If you did, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and also be sure to back me on Patreon, because just by pledging $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.